The last tutorial I did on like pseudo random sound design with Serum got like 10 times more views than I was expecting, so I guess I'm making another one. And today I want to talk about snares because it's a topic dear and close to my heart, and this is kind of like my folder of snares that I've personally synthesized because that's what we're going to talk about, synthesizing snares. Um, so you can see that I've done this a lot. There's a lot of snares here. Um, each of these takes me about like half an hour to 45 minutes to make. Um, that's really cool. I really like doing it. There's a lot of drum and bass guys making their own snares. I've watched a lot of people make different snares on YouTube. There's plenty of tutorials out there. I've kind of realized that everyone sort of has their own method. Like there was this one video where Noisia, like one of the guys from Noisia, was talking about a snare in their track, and the snare was literally just like 9 layers of Serum, which is just so many layers, you know. Um, Personally, I don't really like a super layered approach. It just doesn't really work for me. Um, what I prefer to do instead is do like a long processing chain at the end of my synth. And I want to say that there's like not one method of making snares that I believe to be superior. Like there's all sorts of different approaches that you can take, and in the end, it's all about finding out what works best for you personally. Um, and that's a matter of finding different techniques and seeing what other people are doing, but also doing it yourself a lot. And as you can see, I've done that, but I feel like I'm really just barely getting started with making snares and stuff. But anyway, what I just wanted to do today is kind of show you what I do to make a snare, and how I go about it, and sort of my mindset, so that hopefully you can take some elements from this approach and use them in your own productions, and then hopefully you'll learn something. So with that out of the way, let's listen to some of the snares that I've made so you can kind of get an idea. I personally really like really high pitched and tight snares like that one, or this one's a bit on the long side, but it's pretty high pitched. I also recently made this thing, pretty cool, and this one's really more sort of an EDM kind of snare, I guess. But whatever, it's lots of fun to be had with snares, lots of different things you can do. So my approach usually starts with Serum, but you can also use like Operator or any other synth. And then I like to do one of a couple of things. Like sometimes I'll take like one oscillator to be like the body and one oscillator to be like the transient. So we can start with that, see what we get out of that. So we just start with the transient. I'll use oscillator B for that. And then I choose kind of a pretty high note to start with. And I turn off the random and the phase, and then I usually set the phase to like 90 degrees or something on the sine wave, because when you think about like what's going to happen is that it's going to start at this point of the waveform. So in a very short time, it's going to jump up from complete silence to this, which kind of produce like a click. Like you can hear if I pull up the attack to 0 and then play this. It kind of starts with a click. Whereas if I set it to 0, then the click is much less present. So you can kind of use that to get a little bit of an extra transient out of your sound. So I just start with an LFO, really short set to envelope mode, something like that, and then maybe a bit more like this. Can even set this to 1/8 note to get a bit more resolution out of this. And then we'll just do this big ass pitch fall. So this is like, even. So that's pretty cool. And then I just use a second oscillator to kind of make the body, and also turn the random off. because in general, I like to use very long processing chains, and then the more randomization you have, the bigger the effect is going to be down the chain. So it can be nice to just minimize that as much as possible. And then I like tight snares, so just do something like that. Maybe a bit more of a sustain. Something like that. So maybe I'll give that a bit of a pitch fall as well. So just check that on envelope mode and just do, oops, oh fuck. Let's not assign something to the pan. Yeah, just kind of. Actually, I feel like that's messing too much with the sound we have. This is pretty cool like this. So you can also use the noise to make it transient, by the way. That can also be a pretty cool technique. And then, of course, noise is also what you use to make the tail. So just kind of turn that off and give that kind of a cool shape like this. That's sounding pretty tight. Bit loud. That's fine. And then I like to kind of high pass the noise as well. Something like this. And then, of course, run the noise through the filter. And yeah, from there it can also be nice to kind of play with the filter, because if you just use noise, the snare is going to kind of sound really, really synthetic, but if you give it just a bit of filter movement, it can really sound alive. Okay, so then I usually crash it really hard into a distortion. And then I slap another envelope on that to really get sort of a crunchy transient. You can play around with these different ones. I really like the stomp box. It's like a new saturation, this thing in Serum. Can be a pretty nice sound. You can also maybe the tape saturation. It's not giving me enough crunch though. And then to kind of shape the tail and the transient a bit more, I usually take two filters in the EQ section here, and then I just kind of wire those up with another LFO. Just give it like a bit of gain, make it kind of wide, and then what's really nice to do is if you give that some movement as well in the frequency. So now you get that sort of upward sweep, like, you know, so if you turn that off, you can hear the difference that that makes. You can also put that before the distortion, because if I do it after, we're already clipping. So do that before, I guess. And then we'll do another one as well. And then maybe we'll give this one kind of like the opposite movement. I'm thinking I want to use this one a bit more for the transient than like this side of the EQ is really doing something with the tail. I'm thinking that this would be better for messing with the transient, so because I'm not getting any good results out of the tail. So I'm really gonna make this curve steeper for the volume of the left EQ band. So we really... We're actually setting kind of a tight bandwidth is really cool in this case, because it kind of creates an extra sort of harmonic. Sounds kind of cool. It's really cool to play with like filter resonances to kind of create like ringing sounds. And sometimes I also just synthesize it, like instead of having like a separate snare or a separate body and transient, I'll just have like one oscillator that's doing the body and the transient, and the other is just doing like a high whistle layer, sort of like typically around like 1K or something. That's what I did on this one. You can hear like the high end. I can show you even on span. If I just play this snare, you can see around here there's like a random peak. That's really giving the snare a lot of character, I think. So yeah, of course this snare right now sounds really dull, and I don't think there's much more that I can do within the synth. Maybe I could add a bit of reverb, but yeah, at this point I'm feeling pretty confident about starting like post-processing, so that's exactly what I'm going to do. So the first thing that I'm thinking is the tail in this snare really sounds like shit. Like it literally just sounds like a synth playing a sine wave and some noise, which is at this point exactly what this sound is. So what I like to do is I like to add some reverb, and I'm going to use the snare reverb rack that I made, and I'll show you what that does, because it's kind of like my secret weapon on snares, but not really super secret. So first I'm just going to drag this reverb out of here so you can kind of hear, like, you know, this is what it sounds like with just reverb. But there's something weird going on here, because I got some extra plugins in this reverb chain, in this wet chain. So what's going on here is that there's a transient shaper in front of the reverb. And the reason I have that is because I find that a lot of times with snares, the transient, you know, is of course this really high energy thing at the beginning of your sound. So if you have the transient and the body of the snare going into the reverb, then the reverb sound will be mostly produced by the transient with a little bit of influence from the body and tail. But I don't really like that sound, because if I just set it to all the way wet, it's, you know, you can really hear the transient in the reverb, which is not what I want. So one thing that you can do is you can like reduce the early reflections. That reduces this a bit. But what I like to do is I like to transient shape the signal before it goes into the reverb. So you can see here I have like a free transient shaper plugin that's just turning the transient all the way down. So if we just listen to that, we can hear that the transient is just completely gone. If I turn that off, it's back. So because we completely remove the transient, we get a much nicer reverb signal. And then you can just mess with that a bit, EQ it a bit. And then we can just dial that in with the dry signal. I like to keep the stereo width to not too large, because if you make it too large, then you know, I layer down the chain. I might do this process again, like I might repeat this several times for a single snare, you know, because I like to do a lot of post-processing. And then if you do a lot of processing that adds stereo width to your sound, if you do it too much, then the sound's just going to end up being crazy wide, which may sound like awesome when you're sound designing, but try fitting that into a mix. Pro tip, you can't. So I like to keep the stereo width down a bit. And yeah, kind of like the extra tail, but I'm feeling that at this point the snare just needs a bit more punch, so I'm just gonna like compress the shit out of it. Maybe give it a bit more of an attack time to let the transient through, and then turn that all the way up. At this point, I feel like the fundamental is sustaining a bit too long. So yeah, that thing. What you could do is you could go back into the synth and dial that back, but that's also going to affect what the reverb is doing and what the compressor is doing. So that's kind of scary to me anyway. So what I like to do is I like to, wow, that sounds funky. I like to grab a plugin to do that. So I'm going to use Nova, which is this awesome free dynamic equalizer plugin. We can just take this band and set it to the fundamental, make it kind of tight, and then yeah, something like that. And then you can like set a threshold and attack and release and a ratio, and you can essentially use each EQ band in the same way that you would use a compressor or an expander, depending on where you set this ratio knob. So I like to use this plugin a lot because you can really sort of redefine the transient of the sound with this. So if I say I wanted like more 1K in my transient, I can just take this, turn it all the way up to plus 7 dB, make it a bit more tight because I want these frequencies specifically, and I just turn on the threshold and then bring that all the way down, set the attack time to around 10 seconds because that's kind of like the time scale that transients exist on, like or 10 to 20 milliseconds, and then I just kind of do something crazy like that, really. So you can hear that really sort of fucks your transient up in new and interesting ways. So by doing this, essentially, we're letting through a lot of 1 to 2K on the transient, but then after about 13 milliseconds, it's fully ducked down to, you know, about here. So on the tail, there's a lot less of that frequency. So you can really let certain frequencies pop. We can also just do it through expanding the sound. So we just set this back to 0, set a really short attack and release time, and then just do something like this. Both have a bit of a different sound, so it's just really a matter of preference. But what I was doing is I was gonna mess with the length of the fundamental because I wanted that to just. Yeah, I think that's cool. So at this point, I'm thinking that I want a bit more of a metallic-y ring to the snare because those kind of really metallic-y snares are really cool. You can do that in the synthesis stage if you just add like another layer that's tuned to like something inharmonic to the sound. But that's too late for that now, so I'm just going to use Corpus. And I usually like plate. It's pretty cool. Something like this. But I'm again getting the problem with the transient interfering too much with the sound of Corpus, which would in other cases be the sound of the reverb. So I'm just gonna take this and chuck the Corpus into my snare reverb rack where the reverb would usually be. So high pass it a bit. It's really cool. This material knob on Corpus kind of allows you to change the decay time, but like in a frequency specific way. So if you turn it this way versus this way, like if you turn it all the way up, the low frequencies decay really quickly and the high frequencies decay a bit slower. And if you turn it all the way this way, it's the other way around. So can dial that in. Turning the inharmonic knob up or down is really cool also, because that just makes the pitches in the sound be non-harmonic, which really creates a metallic-y sound. And then I'm just going to turn the width down as well. And also, if you see this light, this is basically like a built-in limiter. And then whenever the limiter is engaged, this light turns on. So that's kind of, if you don't want it to limit your Corpus sound, then you can just turn down the gain a bit. But in this case, reducing the stereo width solved my issue there. Okay, this is really cool, but there's a bit of the sound, like at the end here, like it rings on for too long. So the obvious solution to that is either resampling and giving it a bit of a fade, but you can also just use a gate. I always set the look ahead to be as large as it can, so the gate can open before the start of the transient. And then we can just mess with these hold and release parameters. And yeah, I'll use gates quite frequently in making snares, because by adding all of these reverbs and these other things that ring to the sound, you can really create a really long tail, which is typically not what I want. I prefer my snares to be really tight and snappy. That's just a matter of taste, really. So I'm also thinking that just still a bit too much ringing of the fundamental, like it's too prominent for me. So I'm gonna try to see if EQing the fundamental a bit down makes it better. No, it just makes it lose all its powers. So I'm just gonna use like a multi-band dynamics plugin set up in like an audio effect rack, so we can sort of split the signal into two frequency bands. And then I'm just gonna chuck a gate on the low band. So if you listen to this, this is pretty much where the fundamental is, and the high band is pretty much everything else. Now the high band already sounds fine, but the low band just needs to be a bit shorter. So actually I'm gonna use a transient shaper, because Transpire also has this cool feature where you can sort of turn down the sustain and turn up the attack. I like the distortion on that, so I might give it a bit of saturation in there. Like just maybe do that, and just fade a bit of that in, and then I'm just finally gonna round that off with a gate, because I'm not quite getting it to where I want. Sounds a bit better without the distortion, actually. Yeah. No, it's a bit too loud, so we can just turn this chain down a bit. Cool. So it's kind of a wonky looking fundamental, I think, but it's probably fine. And you can always, when you export it, layer it with other snares to really get close to the sound you want. But I'm gonna cut things short here because I could spend hours more processing this and really massaging it. But I've already showed most of my tricks and principles I think that I use. So I'm gonna leave it at this. And the final point I want to drive home is that in my technique, the way I personally do it, it's all about the post processing. So this is what we started with the synth, and this is what we ended with, and it's almost a completely different sound. So yeah, that's the final point I wanted to drive home. So thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel and everything. Follow me on Twitter, yada yada yada. If people keep being interested in these videos, I might start a Discord server or something cool like that. So yeah, let me know what you want to see next, and cheers. Bye bye.